I know many of you have been waiting for this, so let's talk about Mac Studio M4 Max, M3 Ultra. I'll add in the result from the Mac Mini M4 Pro, and we're going to do a pro photo and video workflow. This way you can choose the machine that's best suited for your workflow. Let's jump right in. I'm Artist Right. As usual, I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself, in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp to the various tests will be in the description, although it may not be available right away when the video launches. Just a little FYI there. One thing that you can do to definitely help out the channel is to tap on that like button. This way YouTube algorithm will push this to an even larger audience. And if you haven't subscribed yet, well, welcome to the channel. Please consider subscribing. It would definitely help us out a lot. Now, this channel is fully self-funded. If you'd like to help support the channel and you find this information helpful, YouTube Super Thanks works. I'll leave a link to my tip jar in the description. You can also join the channel membership. And if you can also share this video with 3 other individuals who are looking for this information in forums and so forth so we get more views, I would greatly appreciate that. Lastly, this is a one-person show, so please remember to be kind in the comments. If I do make a mistake somewhere, spelling error, whatever that may be, do just let me know in the comments. I'll correct them in a future video. Now for this, we're going to be testing or looking at all these machines in the lineup right now, in addition to many other ones I'm going to share, but I'm going to focus on these particular grouping. Now, I'm also going to be referring to the base and the top, and when I'm talking about that, I'm just referring to the silicon. I'm not talking about going up being the memory and the SSD to like the full spec or anything like that. We're just talking about the silicon. Now with this in mind, let's quickly talk about the M4 Max first. So the base configuration has 36 gigabytes of memory, and that's it. There's no way to upgrade the memory on there. The only thing you can really up on that one is the storage, the SSD. Now if you want more memory, you have to bump up $500, get a silicon upgrade, and also get a combo memory upgrade to 48, and now you are open to upgrading to 64 or 128. Similar story with the Ultra. So the base one is 96. The one that I have in the studio is 256, and we're not going to be testing 96 this time around, but you can see particularly in those tasks where it uses a lot of memory, you'll see where the 256 comes in and play a role a little bit. The top Ultra comes with 96 gigabytes of memory. You have the option to go 256 and then also 512. But if you want 512, you have to go with the top Ultra. There's no other way to really go about that. By the way, if you want to know the performance and efficiency core and also GPU frequency, that's there, and the peak power consumption during my testing. For example, the top M4 Max was at about 90 watts. The base M3 Ultra was at 136. And on the top M3 Ultra, I believe it was consuming like around like 155 or something like that. Now I have all these data. I just didn't put them in the discharge, just focus on like those 2 middle machines there. So let's take a look at all these other machines. See, we're going to take a look at the M2 Max, M1 Ultra, M3 Ultra. I'm going to add this in as like a secondary slide because sometimes if you take a look at these data, these, especially like the Ultra M1 and M2, if you can get them at a really great value, may still be really great machines for you to consider. Now, with that said, I want to point out one big thing, the difference between the Max and the Ultra that not many talk about. We know that there are more CPUs, more GPU cores and everything, but this is particularly for the Video Pro, and that is the Media Engine. So on the Max, there's 1 video decoder. Ultra, there's 2. There's 2 encoders for video on the Max, 4 on the Ultra, and also 4 ProRes versus 2. So if you're doing a lot of video, you're doing a lot of transcoding, I think the Ultra makes a lot of sense regarding that because you're going to cut your time that you need to do all those things in half, and that helps out a lot. This would include like creating proxy files. I mean, it's definitely going to help do a lot of heavy lifting that much faster. We're also going to include all these machines, and the one that we're really going to be focusing on from this group is the M4 Pro. This is the base configuration, and it's performing rather well on many of these tasks. You're also going to see the M4 Pro, M4 Max in the laptop, going back to the M1 Max generation and also going back to the M1 Pro generation. You're going to see all those, including the regular one too. I'm adding all these things in here. Now, when you see these test runs, you're going to see a 2x next to it. That means I'm using the half testing method, meaning instead of doing the 1,000 files, I'm only doing it to 500, and we're doubling the amount of time. In my testing, these have come out fairly consistent, and they really are within a margin of error because these are so slow. I really don't have that kind of time to be running the full 1,000 tests on those. And I'll also add in the result from the test PC when it is appropriate. Now, configuration and buyer's guide will be towards the end, and I'm really proud of this one. I think we're making really great recommendations this time around. When it comes to Apple Silicon, there are two segmentation, more consumer leaning and pro oriented. My recommendation is as follows. If you do creative work for revenue, meaning that your clients pay you, and this is not like a hobby or something like that, definitely consider upgrading from these regular pro or consumer leaning silicon to at least a pro, because it's going to save you a lot of time. And what you're really going to pay there in terms of like increase, you're going to get much more production, and become much more productive from it. And even though you may not upgrade to the Max or the Ultra, I still think it's a worthwhile endeavor. Now, here are my upgrade priorities in order for you to get the most performance per dollar. Start out with the amount of memory. A lot of times now, when it comes to the Max and the Ultra, you're kind of like tied in with the chip family a little bit. That means going from, for example, like the Pro to the Max or the Max to the Ultra, depending on the amount of memory that you want on your system. Once you look into upgrading those, and if you still have money left, I would consider upgrading SSD. Lastly, the chip variants. When you're talking about like let's talk about M3 Ultra. Going from the base to the top is $1,500 more. You're going to see, though, that it doesn't always mean you're going to see that much more performance from it. In fact, it's probably going to be very marginal performance. So my initial thoughts this time around is I really wish that we have the M4 Ultra and we have a clear winner throughout, but we don't. So I'm going to put this thought in your mind. Think about the tasks creatively that you do the most. If you spend a lot of time in Photoshop, think about that. And when you're looking through these like slides and the results you're going to see, keep that in the back of your mind too, because you're going to have to choose a machine based on the tasks that you perform predominantly and primarily. And that's something very interesting to see. I wish we have a machine that's a clear winner throughout, but we don't. And there are a sweet spot, and you're going to find that out too. Now, I'll be taking a pro perspective. Anything that I'm doing in these tests are something that I would normally do in my routine workflow in the studio. I'm also doing a single app testing because I want to see how the silicon's performing from this particular generation compared to the last one on the exact same machine with the exact same OS, and see how things are really working. There are many other ways to configure these machines out there. I'm not going to have every single one in the studio. If you happen to have one that I don't have, or a maxed out one that I don't have in the studio, you want me to test that, especially if you're in SoCal area, please feel free to DM me. I would love to meet up with you somewhere and borrow some time on your machine. Now, I'm not going to send you files for you to test because I want to be running the test myself, but that's just a little FYI there, especially if it's been like about a week or two of me launching this video. Please feel free to reach out. Because the OS has been updated and also the app has been updated, I've also done a lot of referencing and comparative tests, meaning that I pull out a few sample machines from the list and ran all the tests instead of running all the machines I'm only doing on the sample one. And I have verified that for all these Sequoia dot releases and all the app updates and so forth, the variance between all these different like versions and the app versions are within a margin of error, and we're good to go there. So the result that I have from last time around are still going to be valid, with the exception of Capture One, because Capture One, the latest version, have gone in and really utilized GPU speed on exports. So the result from that one's going to be somewhat limiting, but shout out to Capture One for doing that after 4 years. Greatly appreciated though. So the design for Mac Studio are pretty much the same, with the exception of like the Max having the 2 ports in the front being USB-C versus Thunderbolt. You talk about like the heatsink design's a little bit different, all copper on the Ultra. I think it's a copper aluminum mix on the Max. But what's interesting though, in my observation, is that on the Max, you do the exact same task compared to the Ultra. The Ultra fan just doesn't really kick up. It's just very silent, same level. On the Max, the fan will come up a little bit and you do hear a light hum. It is lighter and a lower level relative to, for example, the Mac Mini M4 Pro, but nonetheless, it is there. And with this in mind, Apple have also released a new low power mode, so you can tell your machine fan not to really ramp up, especially if you're in a recording studio or something like that. I thought that was interesting that this mode just came up, but yeah, the Mac Mini fan is definitely a much higher pitch. It's not loud and crazy loud by any means, but it's a higher pitch than the Mac Studio, so just something to think about that there. I've also run a calibration test for both hardware and software, and this passes without any problems. My recommendation for Creative Pro, especially if you're coming from an Intel generation machine, is to start out as a fresh machine. I'm going to try to have my setup guide, the things that I do to just set up my machine and make it like mine, hopefully up online soon so you guys can watch that. Now here is how you will read the spec, and like I said before, some of them you will see a 2x. Those are going to be on the regular vanilla silicon, and that means I'm using the double timing method. All right, when it comes to SSD, you can always expand this. In fact, the SSD on these machines are fairly modular. They're not fully like there yet, meaning that there are some companies making them, but you're still paying a lot of money. So I would just kind of look into getting the size that you probably want and maybe not going too much, because you can always plug in an external SSD, hard drive, NAS, DAS, whatever that may be. Here are the speeds on them. They're perfectly fine. I mean, even just the Ultra comes with like 1 terabyte as the base already. That's a lot of storage, or it should be more than enough for a lot of people to get you started. Here's the rest of the machines in the lineup. It's if you want to see those values. And lastly, I made a video doing a test regarding SSD speed. I have a really fast one versus a fairly slow SSD, or like a 500 megabytes per second one. There's almost no difference in timing between those. So you may not necessarily need to get the fastest one and spend a lot of money trying to get the Thunderbolt 5 and the latest, greatest technology, because the only time you're going to see that benefit is when you're really downloading files to the SSD. Otherwise, you're not really going to be noticing that too much at all. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. You can check that out. When it comes to RAM in the system, definitely configure the RAM as much as you're going to need, and also think for the future too if you're going to keep your machine longer. The reason why I say this is because these are not upgradable. They're not modules that you can pop out and like pop something in by a third party. It doesn't happen that way. It's tied to the silicon, and there's no way to upgrade these. So the only way to do it is to buy a brand new machine. Now, if you're not sure how much RAM you need, especially if you are a Mac user right now, I recommend restarting your system. When it restarts, launches Activity Monitor, go into memory and take a look at the memory pressure, and start going through your daily routine of working, going through your files, going through Lightroom, going through Photoshop, and see where your memory pressure is. If you're in the green, in general, the amount of memory that you have in your system right now should be pretty much good for you. But if you're in yellow or red, you might want to consider bumping up to the next memory storage tier, and that's going to be something that helps you out a lot. Now, personally, I don't use Activity Monitor. I use iStat Menu because it keeps my memory pressure stats for up to like 28 days. I can go back and see how I am using the memory and utilizing my machine. One thing that I have noticed is that there are some slight slowdown trend over time, but I'll point that out when I do see those. All right, Lightroom Classic 14.2. Let's take a look at one-to-one preview for 1000 Sony a7R5. These are 61 megapixel files, and what I'm going to do here is put down the price tag next to it. This way we get to see things a little bit clearer. Something to note, especially on the M3 Ultra base, is that my current configuration is that price, but I'm always going to be referencing this one for tasks that doesn't really utilize a lot of memory, or there's not that big difference in the memory. So we can see some of the price variation there. This is $1,500 for a little bit over a minute gain right there. This is a top Ultra. So this is the M4 Max and the base M4 Max right there. Interestingly enough, the base M4 Max is supposed to be performing slightly better than the M4 Pro, which is this one right here, but it's not. And I ran that test twice. This is still the same results. So when it comes to this particular task, I think the M4 Pro is really a great contender. And if you want like a sweet spot between price and performance, I still think that the Mac Studio M4 Max for many creative out there are going to be a really fantastic machine. This is what happens when we add in the result from the M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and also M2 Max in there. You can see how this spreads out. The M2 Ultra and the M1 Ultra are holding on to itself pretty much, doing pretty well there. I would say that, you know, if you can find these at a really great value, it may not be a bad idea at all. And here's the rest of the other machines for consideration. Now let's take a look at export for these 1000 files. When we take a look at this, I'm also going to put in the price tags next to them. This way you can see. Interestingly enough, the M3 Ultra base, the one that I have, is coming out ahead. And this, it's not really something that have to do with like memory or anything like that, because Lightroom Classic for this particular task uses CPU and GPU. It doesn't really go in and utilize the memory as much. What's interesting though is the M3 Ultra. The top spec one was not doing really well. I ran this test twice and the number comes out the same. And sometimes we see some wonkiness happen where we add in a few extra cores and the program doesn't go in and utilize that well. I've seen that in past tests before, and I think that's happening with this particular computer. M4 Max top specs right there, and this is the M4 Max base specs. You're going to see that between this $500 increase, you're looking at less than like 30 seconds like increase in time, or like 35 seconds or so. You have to really ask yourself if this is actually really worth it or not. It may be, especially if you need more memory for other tasks. So see how the equation is not quite as easy anymore. I wish, like I said, we have a clear one throughout, but we don't have that. And lastly, this is the Mac Mini M4 Pro. You can see that having less GPU core for these particular tasks, especially now that our photography app are now using GPU core. I think Macs are a really great contender machine. Here is the M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and M2 Max for your consideration right there. This gives you some idea as far as where all these previous generation Ultra machine is landing and the rest of the machine in the lineup for your consideration. All right, Lightroom Classic. HDR merge, let's see how long this is going to take. Timing are pretty much just about the same, and I'm going to go in and add the rest of the machine in the lineup right away. So what we have right now is the M4 generation, M3 generation, and M2 and M1. You can see how they cluster together almost really closely because this is just a single CPU based task and it's going in and utilizing the frequency. This is also part of the reason why I really wish we have an M4 Ultra instead of just the M3 Ultra so that we can just be at the top spec there. But for something like this, it's just marginally behind at best, where it actually pulls out ahead on the export and so forth, where it utilizes a lot of GPU. It does pull out ahead quite a bit, but you really have to justify whether you can, you know, afford something like that or really need something like that in the studio or not. Here's the rest of the computer in lineup. You can see how the M4 generation are clustering at the top there, and you can see the spread as we go down too. Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. So this is a task that uses CPU and RAM in combination. And when we take a look at this, we can see that the Ultra, because it has a lot of memory, these are within a margin of error of each other. Going down to the 48 gigabytes of memory takes a little bit longer. Here's the M4 Max and also the M4 Pro, but we also cut down the amount of memory available on the system too. When we add in a few of the other machines, for example, M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and also M2 Max, you start to see where the spreads are on that one. And like I said, the previous generation machine, especially the M2 Ultra and also M1 Ultra, is holding its own pretty much fine there. So if you have those, you may still be good to go without having to really bump up a machine this time around. Here's the rest of the result for your considerations. And now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic AI Noise Reduction. Now this is a task that's supposed to be running on your NPU, but there are some errors on there or some like color fringes and things that happen. That's why it's now just running on the GPU. But when it ran on an NPU though, it's definitely not much faster. But anyhow, based on this, what we're seeing so far, having more GPU cores on the system is definitely helping out. These two are within a margin of error each other, and everything is like about a second more as you cascade down this chart there. So not too much of a difference, although when you start to get to the M4 Pro, it does take a little bit longer compared to the rest of the machine. And when we start to do a relative comparison, for example, comparing the Pro to the Ultra, you're talking about half, a little bit more than half the amount of time at this point. Now you're talking about a $1,399 or $1,400 machine versus a $4,000 machine, but those are some things to think about too. Depending on how much you do these tasks, it may be worthwhile. Now I'm also going to add in the other machines in the lineup. Let's take a look at Lightroom Classic Noise Reduction for 10 files, running this as a batch. I've also put the price tag there so that you can see. But when we talk about the silicon and the variants, for example, the base versus the top, very little gain for a very high price point. Same thing is being reflected on the Max Silicon. Very little gain for a price variation that's not quite as high relative to the Ultra, but it's still a price variation there. And you can see where the M4 Pro is landing on that one. When we add in the other silicon, for example, M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and M2 Max, this gives us something to think about. This is where we're saying, like, if you can find a really great deal either on the refurb or just use M2 Ultra for that matter, stock configuration with 64 gigabytes of memory, it may be a really great contender for you to get, especially if you can get one that is priced at or below, for example, the M4 Max Top Silicon right now at around $2,500. So just something to think about there. This is the rest of the machine, and we're going to do AI, sky, and subject masking for this one. You can see how these are going to be clustering based on the generation of the silicon. For example, you can see right there M4, M3, M2, and M1. So these are just based on the generation. This is why I was saying earlier in the video that I wish we have the M4 Ultra so that we have the top performance throughout, but that's not the case. So the architecture matters when it comes to these tasks. And yeah, this is using GPU, but there's only a few of them that is really being used for this one. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom. This is version 8.2, and this export uses CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination. Very different than Lightroom Classic. So what I'm also going to do is add in the rest of the other machines in the lineup. We can see that the Ultra are performing fairly close to each other, not that much of a difference. This is where the M4 Max, the top versus the base, lands on this chart, and interestingly enough, M2 Ultra is doing pretty well. Like I said, if you can find a really good deal on those, it might be something to consider. M1 Ultra, M2 Max, and M4 Pro. When it comes to something like this, the Pro, anything that uses GPU, the Pro are not going to do quite as well. And this is something that I would say that because our apps can now really go in and utilize GPU as a photographer, you might want to really consider getting the Max Silicon. Same thing with Capture One. It can now go in and utilize the GPU core on the system. Let's take a look at the import. This is using CPU only, and here's the price tag for each of those machines. But you can see that, interestingly enough, the Top Ultra is not doing really well here. There's some glitch that's happening with this particular Top Ultra because I ran this test twice, and this is not the first test that is not showing the top result, even though it's supposed to like beat out everything, but it's really not clearly doing that. Base Max though, or Base Ultra though, is actually doing pretty good there and is pulling up quite ahead. This is the M4 Max, comparing these two together, and the Pro. The Pro is, slow a little bit behind, but it's really not that bad. But we're going to see this really, get a little bit further behind even when we start to add in the export that uses the GPU. This is where the M2 Ultra and M1 Ultra lands, and M2 Max. M2 Max is coming in pretty much dead flat on this one, and you can see how it spreads out in the rest of the computer. Now let's talk about the export. This export is rather interesting because this is the price tag for all these machines. Obviously, the one that has the most GPU core is doing better, but this 20 extra GPU cores, if you take a look at this price compared to this one, and this, by the way, is a task that uses GPU, but it doesn't really go in and utilize the memory that much, so it's not really making that big of a difference there. But you can see how that $1,500 really equated itself to not that much, especially when you get to like the top of the pyramid, such as the Ultra. You're not going to see that much performance gain. These are the two Max relative comparison, and I would say that this is a pretty good sweet spot, like the top M4 Max Silicon, especially in the Max Studio. It's performing fairly well there. You can see how the Pro is falling behind. Let's see where the previous generation M2 Ultra and M1 Ultra, also M2 Max, is coming there. You can see how this is like spreading throughout. This gives you a lot of thoughts and consideration. For example, if you have the M1 or M2 Ultra right now, you might be good to go. Or if you're looking to get, for example, the M4 Max, if you can get this one at a price that's below that with a stock configuration and 64 gigabytes of memory, I mean, that might be a really great contender for you to think about. Here's the rest of the export for the other machines. I don't have the full chart here just because I didn't ran on everything, just only on the machine that is relevant to this conversation that we're talking about. Photoshop, I'm using Digital Lloyd Chambers test on this one. We're doing 3 of these tests, and you can see the result there. I'm also going to add in the rest of the desktop. So this is one of those where it's just generational. M4, M3, M2, and M1, something that we have seen before. And even though this may seem like it's taking longer, this is close to 3 seconds already, and this is a little bit over 4 seconds. So you're talking about like just 1 second apart. This is really not that big of a deal when it comes to Photoshop speed. But this also tells you a big picture too, that if you're doing a lot of Photoshop work, as you're going to see as I'm showing you right now, you're going to be much better off just getting, for example, the M4 Max. That's going to be the way to go. I mean, getting the Ultra Silicon is only going to do you very little when you're running Photoshop. This is a task for 15.7 gigabyte file. This is a medium task. You can see that, interestingly enough, the 4 obviously is coming up ahead of like the M3 generation, and the M4 Pro generation is actually falling behind a little bit on this one, which is rather interesting. It's clustering up with like the M2s and the M1s, so the clustering is a little bit off on this, but part of this too is because this one has less memory in the system. So that's something to really note as well, that if you have, for example, the M4 and you give it like, for instance, 48 gigabytes of memory or something like that, it will probably be clustering somewhere like up here below the M4 Max, because it can really perform, and is really just using mostly RAM and just like 1 CPU core. So just something to think about there. And lastly, Photoshop Huge. I will add in the rest of the machine. Actually, I'm going to show you just this one for now. You can see how like the Ultra is performing really close, and even though you bump up the memory by that much, timing variation is only like in seconds. But as you start to expand a machine out, they start to take that much longer when you start to reduce the amount of memory that's available to the system. So here it is. You can see a lot of this is really linked to memory, but 96 is more than enough. Like 128, you can see where the memory is. The more memory you have when you work with large files, you're going to see more benefit from that. Not everybody works with these kind of files, but there are many that do. And if you do, this is definitely going to help you. Now we're also going to take a look at Photoshop with a Puget bench test. So these are the machines. Interesting enough, like what I said before, the newer architecture in the M4 is coming out ahead. M3, M2, and M1. You can see how it's cascading there, and here are the result comparing with the other machines in the lineup. Encoder decoder engine. Remember, we talked about in the very beginning how the Macs have one video encoder, one video decoder, 2 video encoder, and 2 ProRes encoder, whereas on the Ultra, this pretty much doubles everything. So that doubling is definitely help giving you more performance, and we can see how the Ultra is just really clustering up at the very top there. We can see where the Macs are. Now this is almost regardless of generation, although I will point out that on the M4 generation, notice how like even though this group of like Macs are all clustering together, the timing is shorter. That's because Apple, I believe they redesigned or re-engineered their encoder decoder engine on the M4 generation, so it's much faster. Sadly, we don't have the M4 Ultra to get that like the little bit more in speed, and I wish we do have that. So just something that I'm pointing out there. Here is the Pro and also the regular. Now you're going to see the Pro and the regular are going to be really close to each other because it half the encoder decoder engine compared to like the Max model, but some of them are going to be much slower machines, some of them are passive cooling or just machine that has like, you know, less thermal dissipation and so forth. You're going to see the result being repeated in the HEVC. This is 8-bit export. Ultra is going to be at the very top. These are the Max. You start to get the idea. Similar idea in the ProRes, even though interesting enough, M3 Ultra is pulling just slightly ahead there on the ProRes encoding, and it's just taking forever for these regular M1 generation machines. So just something to view there. All right, Adobe Benchmark. This is using After Effects using the Adobe Benchmark. I was told that this is no longer on their blog site, so I would probably contact whoever posted that blog site and see if they can post that benchmark thing again. But anyway, this is the result between all these machines. I'm also going to add in the price tag so you can see. Interesting enough, there's a glitch there. I'm going to just leave that there. This is it's $2,000. Let's just put it that way. So the timing gain between the base versus the top, very marginal, right? For that $1,500. Again, we're also seeing that being repeated here too. $500 more, but you're gaining less than about a minute in terms of performance bump. And the M4 Pro is really doing just fine. This is why I was saying earlier that it's no longer like a clear cut. We have a winner that's in all the categories and the price point makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of really thinking that we have to do. Here's the M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and also M2 Max for your comparison so that you can see where that lands in the chart right now. Obviously, M4 Max is really eking out the performance of the M2 Ultra on many of the categories, but not on all just yet. And you have to imagine this too, like this, or think about this, is 2 architecture generations behind this current one. So the Ultra is actually holding on pretty much well in many cases, but just maybe not the fastest machine out there anymore when it comes to like the M2 generation. Here's the Premiere Pro. This is Puget Bench, so obviously M3 Ultra are pulling up at the top, and the way this is scaling the way how we would expect it to go. With the rest of the machine added in a lineup, for example, M2 Ultra, M1 Ultra, and you can see how the M4 Max top, M4 Max base are just kind of going in there. Like the top one is going above the M2 Ultra by a little bit, and the base one is coming below the M2 Ultra by a little bit, just right above the M1 Ultra. So this is about like how we can expect the whole spread to really go. And here are the other machines. And lastly, we're going to take a look at DaVinci Resolve. And this one also falls in line with the way how we are expecting it to go. Even though the top one, there is a performance increase, but it's really marginal at best at that point, right? M2 Ultra is still pulling out ahead on both the M4 Max when it comes to Resolve on these tests, M1 Ultra, M2 Max, and M4 Pro right there. As we start to get lower in the chart, you start to get the idea and see results. So that has been the testing for the M4 Max, M3 Ultra, and also M4 Pro. I hope that you find those information helpful because, I mean, trying to make a decision to buy these machines now are not going to be easy. That's why I told you in the very beginning, think about the tasks that you do most. Maybe come up with like your top 3 apps that you use and a task that you do a lot of those, and look at my videos and see what processes, what resources is using on the system, and using those as a basis to make your decision which one is going to be the best one for you, because sadly this time around there are no all-around winners. Now if you're a new purchase, right, I think the sweet spot, especially for photography, will probably be the Max. I would probably say the Max, and it will be the top silicon, because that enables you to get more memory. But even though you upgrade from the base to the Max, you're also gaining a little bit more memory there, and we're seeing those performance jump that I think is definitely worthwhile. Now another thing that I do want to share with you too is that if you start to upgrade the Max Silicon, like the top M4 Max Silicon, when you start to bump the 512 to, like, for instance, to the 1 terabyte SSD, you start to bring that up to maybe like 128, you're getting into that ultra territory already, maybe $100 to like $300 variation. So just something to think there. I mean, it might not be a bad idea to really jump up. So that spread is still there. That enticing when you start to get to the top is really still there. But also ask yourself if you can use it or not. Now, if you do video, if you do photo and you happen to do video, I would say ultra all the way. Why not? I mean, because you can definitely utilize those. Now, if you're upgrading, depending on the silicon you're on right now, it's not that easy, right? So I have an upgrade chart at the end, but remember the upgrade priority. So start out with the amount of memory on your system, how much you want to have, because you're going to get the most performance per dollar when you upgrade and you bump the memory up on your system. Next would be like the chip family. Although I would say, like, even though I recommend memory upgrading, if you're already at the Ultra, going from 96 to like 256 in this M3 Ultra generation, not really going to do you that big of a difference at all, unless you're constantly working with large files all the time, or you're, like I said, if you're crazy like me, you have too many tabs, too many browsers, too many apps open, you're going to see the benefit there. Then the SSD, and then the chip variants. But the chip variants you already saw. We've just proved that here, that the gain that you're going to get from bumping that chip variance up is going to be really small. So now let's take a look at this chart. This is my recommendation. Good, better, best, read that across. Lightroom Classic, good to be Pro. Better would be the Max. If you want the best performance possible, get the Ultra, hands down, because these apps can go in and use it. When it comes to Photoshop, if you're just doing predominantly Photoshop, working a singular file, M4 Pro, M3 Max, or M4 Max are going to give you the best performance. Ultra is really not going to do a lot. Now, Photoshop is ancillary to all these, for example, Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, or Capture One, then yeah, the Ultra is still going to make a lot of sense. All right, now for Capture One, interestingly enough, the better M1 Ultra is there, not the, it's not part of the best. The best, though, would be the M4 Max, M2 Ultra, and M3 Ultra. You can see that in the results in the chart too, and then all the other Max generations are also there for, your considerations. And lastly, when it comes to like the video, I highly recommend going with the Ultra, because I mean, if you're gonna do a lot of video encoding, decoding, that can take quite a bit of time, and having double the amount to cut that time in half is definitely really helpful. Now we're talking about pretty high-end machines here, so we're starting at what, 36 gigabytes of memory. We're not gonna really think about that much. Although if you're looking at the Mac Mini M4 Pro, you're starting at what, 18 gigabytes of memory. I mean, that might be something, or excuse me, 24 gigabytes of memory. That might be something you want to think about, like maybe bumping up to like 48 or even like 64, especially if you like have the Mac Mini. I think that might be helpful. As far as minimum SSD go, I would say 512 is the bare minimum. 1 terabyte is a pretty good sweet spot for me, but that's, ultimately going to depend on your workflow. Lastly, for upgraders, the best way that you can use this chart is to circle the silicon that you're on. For example, if you are on the M4, going to the Pro for both M3 and M4 are going to give you a much better performance bump. Or one thing that you can always do is actually just jump the chart and go to the M1 Ultra. If you can find out a really good price, you're also going to get a really good performance jump there. Now, this was a solid line before. I've changed this into a dotted line, because the M4 Max going to the M3 Ultra, is that going to be a performance jump? Yes. Is it going to be across all the categories? No. Like I said before, there are no clear winners when it comes to this round for computers. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that I have. Now, if you'd like to see me do a comparison, for example, between the M4 Max base configuration versus, for instance, like the stock configuration, just the Mac Mini M4 Pro, or for example, doing the M4 Max versus the M3 Ultra. I mean, there's a lot of names here. I'm trying to get it all straight. Do those kind of like subdelineate comparison. Do let me know in the comment section below, because I do have some of those planned, but I do want to get some of your thoughts too, as far as what you want to see. Anyway, this is hopefully a pretty comprehensive test for all these machines, and it will give you a pretty good idea as far as what's going to fit in your workflow. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. I'm Art, and I thank you for your time.